In the week before research and marketing, the four of us hammered out a number of game idea concepts that we all felt were pretty solid. A total of 9 to 10 ideas got pared down to 2, and we submitted them for approval. In our first meeting for RAM, as we got a better understanding of the timetable for getting the game completed, it became clear that our initial set of ideas were the developmental equivalent of shooting the moon. Quartermaster Quandary was born from a distilled version of one of the 2 ideas we had submitted, a version that still captured a lot of the gameplay elements we wanted to present, but with a much narrower scope. Our initial vision entailed a much larger network of tracks and battlefronts to deal with, as well as more complex systems for requisitioning supplies and directing trains. We wanted the game to engage the player on a level consistent with the unit and resource management aspect found in many real-time strategy games. On paper, this all sounded fantastic. However, our goal for each of these levels was that they would provide about 5 to 10 minutes worth of gameplay for a first-time player. Our concept of having the player orchestrate some grand strategy for managing a sprawling network of train routes just did not mesh with the amount of time that we were targeting for each level. Something had to give. Ultimately, we decided we could still deliver on the types of experience we wanted to provide by focusing heavily on presenting the player with a series of quick, successive decisions rather than bogging things down with long-term planning and resource management.
During my time with Quartermaster Quandary, I was given the opportunity to explore the discipline of designing a level to facilitate the flow and experiences of a game. This was my first time with a strategic puzzle game, such as this, giving me a chance to flex my skills to generate consistent, engaging levels under these parameters. Track structuring was identified as a crucial element to the success of our game, as it would be heavily reliant on using the tracks to create the challenges and poise the means to solve the level. In the beginning, the screen flow was a bit constricting as its formula positioned the trains to spawn at the bottom, with a myriad of tracks sweeping toward the top of the screen where the battlefronts were. By rotating the flow to instead travel from left to right, we achieved an increase in screen real estate while also adding structure to the various on-screen objects, allowing the player to more rapidly process the data being presented to them. In early production, originating during the time the game spent running vertically, the entry points for the supply trains were on one side of the screen, whereas battlefronts were only located on the other. The static placement of entry and exit points was rapidly exhausting its pool of available track layouts. Our goal was to include multiple levels that could provide the player with enough variation to keep the player engaged. To achieve that, we needed to generate interesting track layouts that required the use of a variety of skills and applications thereof. By relocating spawn locations and battlefronts to now reside on the left or right of the screen, and in some cases the center, trains can now run parallel to each other in opposite directions, effectively changing the way we design our levels.
One of the very first things we discussed as a team was the limited amount of assets we had at our disposal. After all, no one on the team had 3D modeling experience, and the assets library we were given access to was tailored more towards indoor environments. As our game was completely based outdoors, this made it a bit difficult to utilize that particular resource. The UDK assets library itself lends itself more to a first-person shooter scenario than the top-down style game we chose for our final project, Quartermaster Quandary. So all in all, we had plenty of challenges right from the start. To combat these, we had to take a really hard look at the models and textures that were available, and dismiss ones that were clearly not an option. Robot meshes, vehicles, and castle parts, although tempting, really wouldn't fit the overall theme of the game, so that narrowed our choices down even more. Seeing as Quartermaster Quandary had to include diverse locations, we eventually had to become quite creative with the meshes we could use. Some of the techniques we used for achieving varied landscape involved using the exact same mesh over and over, or repurposing meshes that wouldn't normally be used in the manner we did. As an example, in level 1, most of the cliffs are the exact same mesh. Through duplication, stretching, scaling, and rotation, we are able to give the illusion of many different types of rocks, boulders, and cliffs. These techniques were used throughout the game, allowing us to create breathtaking locales. The other main technique we used, as mentioned before, was repurposing. On level 3, many of the buildings you see are actually meshes of robot and vehicle parts. Another example are the cranes, which are actually the damaged turret from one of UDK's stock vehicle meshes.
As with many larger projects, one of the biggest things that we had to constantly contend with was the overall scope of our game. Originally, we had much larger and complex designs for the levels that were about 2 to 3 times bigger than our levels currently in the game. It didn't take long for us to realize that this simply wouldn't be possible due to a variety of factors. So as we cut down on the scope of our game, some of the mechanics and things that we had created were no longer necessary or just ill-suited for the current style of gameplay. Two of these mechanics were the storage tracks and the magnetic multi-switch system, also known as the MMSS. The game had become much faster paced, and so the storage tracks simply weren't practical and would take up valuable screen space. The MMSS, which was essentially a multi-destination teleporter, was now largely ineffective due to the much smaller scope of the individual levels. Even the scoring system was revamped numerous times throughout the life of the project as the scope of our game was further tweaked and modified.
In addition to the routes that trains could travel on, the tracks themselves were seeing some iterations of their own. In the beginning, traditional wood and steel tracks were being used, but when we encountered some difficult rotations at sharp angles that were a bit difficult to believe a grounded train could make without utter devastation, we switched to a magnetic rail system. Aesthetically, this looked much more appealing, and it was easier to identify and differentiate from surrounding objects. Moreover, the tracks were modified to visually represent the path the train would currently travel on or avoid, distinguish between a track with a lit blue or unlit and blackened center strip along the track. In order for this to work, 4 tracks needed to be placed where we originally only had 1 at each of the splitting paths along the track. The spline loft actors used to create the tracks posed a bit of a learning curve to them themselves, and resulted in a few setbacks and technical issues. In one case, we were having difficulties with lighting, which we later discovered resulted from having a loft actor with a tangent of absolute 0. But by weathering the storm, we ended up with a track that was easily identifiable, consistent, and conveyed meaningful information to the player that culminated into creating a flow in gameplay that truly strengthened the experience of Quartermaster Quandary. During the iteration phase regarding how to evolve the track layout and take the levels into new territory, a number of mechanics were devised to facilitate layout growth, each tailored to require a particular strategy to overcome a direct flow of trains to break the pace of the game a bit. For example, bombardment and triage levels featured hot and safe zones that would destroy a train unless it was funneled through a safe route that would then limit the possible battlefronts. But perhaps the largest contributor to the evolution of the track schemes came with the addition of teleporters, which offered us an interesting dynamic in how we could manage and more significantly manipulate the flow of the tracks. Now equipped with the freedom to depart a train from any section of the level and have it reappear elsewhere, the tracks began to branch out into some wild, sometimes contorted designs. Dynamic entry and exit point placement, themed obstacles, and teleporters gave the level design more depth while allowing for more creativity and complexity, rather crucial elements to a strategic puzzle game.
While we tried to create military-themed levels and assets, that alone wasn't enough to really convey the experience we were trying to deliver to the players. We wanted the player to feel a sense of accomplishment and be able to rise through the ranks of the military as they progressed through the game. As the player was promoted, they would be transferred to areas of higher importance in order to handle more dangerous missions. This actually tied into our level themes very well and gave a reason as to why new and more difficult mechanics were being introduced. What we ended up doing was having story dialogue at the start of some levels where the player receives instructions from a commanding officer. As the story progresses, the player's character will visually rank up as they receive notifications of their promotions, as well as details for their new assignments. These brief interludes don't slow down gameplay enough to be noticeable, but definitely have a large impact upon the player's experience and makes the game seem more complete, instead of just a random collection of levels and mechanics. Because the game has so many things going on at the same time, usability was extremely important. In our early prototypes, one of the largest problems was with information overload and not being able to process all of the data on the screen quickly enough to make split-second decisions. The primary offender in this case was our Battlefront windows because they were predominantly text-based and hard to read. What we ended up doing to fix this was revamping the windows to use icons and bars that matched the supply cars to make it easy for the player to quickly determine which trains needed to go to the various battlefronts. We also made it so that trains explode when they collide, Battlefront windows flash when they are about to expire, and included on-screen notification when points are either gained or lost to help the player out. However, visual cues by themselves aren't enough to make sure the player is aware of everything going on because of how they are constantly scanning different sections of the screen, so we made sure to include sound effects for all of the important mechanics. Trains have an explosion sound effect to accompany the animation when they collide, trains will play sound effects when they speed up or use brakes, and the player will be notified when battlefronts are completed or failed.
Aesthetics are a vital part of any game, and it was no different in Quartermaster Quandary. When designing the levels for the game and their environments, we faced many of the same issues we encountered with choosing assets. While we had different environments that we wanted the player to experience, the choices were narrowed down by what we had access to. Once again, creativity and out-of-the-box thinking assisted us in obtaining our goal of diverse landscapes in some instances, while others eluded us in the end. If repurposing was useful in our building phase, it became almost mandatory while decorating. At first, prototype levels were mainly barren deserts or grassy plains. Although these were nice looking, they weren't at the level of what we wanted the player to experience. After attempting different ideas that the team bounced around, it ultimately came back to repurposing. This is most evident in the decision to not use the terrain editor. By using ordinary meshes such as a box, statue, and in one case multiple instances of a rubble pile, and then replacing its existing material, we were able to create a snowy paradise, swamp, or waterfall basin. By adding particle effects such as flowing clouds, smoke, and haze, it allowed us to provide the sense of truly being in that environment. With the addition of sound effects, lighting, and storyline, Quartermaster Quandary became an experience and not just a game, right before our eyes.
One of the bigger challenges for us, which started very early on in RAM, was that the game is just so wildly different from the types of shooter or platform games that UDK is so well suited for. We had a game concept here that would ultimately require the spawning, movement, and management of sets of specialized actors, each with their own unique attributes and behaviors. Suffice it to say, our concepts for what we could feasibly do from a "can we actually manage to do this" perspective were informed by what our current knowledge of Unreal Script would allow at the time. In the beginning, things were pretty rough. By the end of the first month, though, we had a pretty solid grasp on most of the basic stuff that we needed to do with Unreal Script in order to implement pretty much any feature we decided to add. On a given week, we would lay out what we planned to accomplish in advance. Often, the bulk of coding would be done before the end of Thursday, allowing us the last 3 days of the week for work in the editor, testing, and bug fixes. One of the other key reasons to start code early in the week is that it was relatively commonplace that we would actually have to figure out how to do something that we had decided to do for that week. The Unreal Developer Network, and Epic Forms both, serve very well for finding examples and explanations for countless topics related to Unreal Script, and there are numerous good video tutorials on YouTube. Our instructors, both past and present, were also able to provide a lot of insight if we struggled with getting anything done. The most important thing to remember, though, is that these things take time. Always start early in the week if it can be helped.